Hey, okay, I'm back. I want to shift gears a little bit. We'll come back to the details of the text and what we were talking about earlier. And on Wednesday, I want to begin thinking about the major stages of the narrative, what I asked you to write about for the Wednesday discussion topic. We'll get to that tomorrow in class. What are the major narrative stages of this poem, and what are some of the themes, or what's the kind of thematic structure of the poem that starts emerging once you begin reading it? But let me shift gears here and show you images from a little PowerPoint that I put together. We can look at this together tomorrow as well. It's here in the content under week 2. There's the Monday feedback topic. There's the discussion topic for Wednesday. Oops, that's too big. And then there's the homework topic. I have a recording of Gilgamesh being read out loud in ancient Akkadian. Let's hear that actually really quickly. That's sort of fun. This is how the ancient language of Akkadian would have sounded, and these are lines from the standard version of the text read in ancient Akkadian.
Gilgamesh ana shashuma izakara ana utana pishtim ruki. Anatarakuma utana pishti. Minatuka ushana ki yatima ata. Uata ushanata ki yatima ata. Gumuka libi ana epeshtukunti. Achi nadat eluserika. Ata kiki tazis inapuku ilani balada teshu. Utana pishti ana shashuma izakara ana Gilgamesh.
Okay, it gives you a feel. That's from tablet 11, where Gilgamesh meets, after a very long journey, he meets Utnapishtim, who has survived the flood. He's a former king of Uruk, but now he has been made immortal by the gods, and he lives on this faraway island in the middle of nowhere. He survived the flood, and Gilgamesh wants to meet him. We'll find out why he wants to meet him, but that's a reading of that part of the poem in ancient Akkadian. I also have, in addition to, so you can go and back and listen to that more if you find that interesting. I find ancient languages fascinating. Also in week 2, we have the videos that I'm making for you right now, and the video from Canopy that tells details of the history of ancient Mesopotamia from the Neolithic period until around 2000. And I shared that with you in an email today, but you can access that video here. Again, you have to be logged in to Canopy, to the library, so I'm not sure the link will work, but you can try it. You can always just access it directly from the library website and database. But here's the slideshow. And while I'm talking, I thought we could look at some images. So here, for example, is an image of one of the tablets from the time that Sinuleki-Un was writing. So it's from around 1100 BC. And that's, so the story that we have that Lombardo is translating comes from these tablets. They all fit in the palm of your hand. They're not very large. Okay, but here is where we are, just to give you a sense of place. The Fertile Crescent, the city of Uruk along the Euphrates River. This is now Iraq. Babylon is the city where the scribe Sinuleki-Un is living when he writes down this tale, and his copy of the story, his tablets, then get moved up north to Nineveh, and there's a library that's built. This is actually along the Tigris River, and this is around the place where the tablets were unearthed by archaeologists in the 19th century. Ur, you may know the name of the city of Ur. This is the city where Abraham's family in Genesis comes from. That's his origin. He comes from Ur, and he will travel far across these deserts down into Egypt and finally settle in Canaan. The story leads us from Uruk to the cedar forest in tablet 5, and here we are supposed to imagine the king and Enkidu traveling up along the river valley to the mountains. You can see there's many mountains up here, and to the forest near the mountains. There are famous cedar forests in Lebanon, over along the Mediterranean coast, but it's not clear exactly how far Gilgamesh and Enkidu are supposed to have traveled. I think most scholars believe that we're supposed to picture this journey as going up into the far north of this Fertile Crescent region. But again, this is a point about reading literally. It's not so important that we be able to map out the geography of their journey. It's kind of an epic mythical journey. The point is that they're going on a journey. They have to leave the city and go into the forest. Where the forest is, where the city is, doesn't matter as much as the fact that this is a story in which the king leaves the city and goes into the forest to kill a monster with his best friend, and then he must return. These events and the structure of the events and how these events relate to each other, that's what's important to the story, not the sort of, being able to chart it out on a map. But we do have a map, and this is the world that these people lived in. And when they talk about rivers, they're thinking of the Euphrates River. When they're talking about mountains, they're thinking about these mountains to the north. They live in a very dry region. Once you get out of the river valley, it's very deserty, it's very dry. But the river is fertile. That's where they grew everything. That's where the cities developed, along that river. This is the origin of sort of early civilization, in part because it was such a fertile valley and it was so easy to grow crops. And so vast cities developed along these rivers, and they became places where they stored grains to feed hundreds of thousands of people. Okay, so just to give a sense of place, that's where we are. But also, this is a photograph of kind of what it looks like. And you can see, today, this is what the Euphrates looks like. Here is a photograph of an ancient site. This is an archaeological site unearthing the foundations of a city. And so while the city of Uruk, is no more, right, some of the foundations of cities like Uruk still exist, okay? And so we can learn a lot about how people lived through archaeological digs like this. Okay, I'm going to come back to you, and we can look at more of this. You can look at that PowerPoint on your own. But before I end this video, I want to just think about specific passages and how to read them. Like if we're not reading them literally, how are we supposed to read them? So for example, again, going back to the prologue, or after the prologue, we have the sort of introduction of the king before the story begins, before we see him striding through the streets like a wild bull, head held high, through Uruk the sheepfold, right? He's trampling his people like a wild bull. That's where the story really begins on page 5, right? The action. But before the story begins, we have the image of the king, right? The greatest king of all, right? Gilgamesh was greater than all other kings. That's on page 4. This is Gilgamesh as he will be remembered by the poet, as the poet wants you to remember him. It is Gilgamesh at the end of the story, after he has gone on his journey, right? And then page 5, we go back to the beginning of the story, right? What Gilgamesh was up to as a young king. He is fighting with all the young men in the streets, and he is frankly raping all of the young women. He has the authority to do so. Okay, so we learn from this text and other texts that kings had the kind of divine right to go on the wedding day of the bride and sleep with the bride before she slept with her new husband. And this king is taking that legal right to do so, or that divine given right to do so, seriously. And for this, the people complain. They complain to the gods because the king is abusing his power. He is acting like a tyrant, I guess you could say. But before we meet Gilgamesh the tyrant, we have an image of Gilgamesh greater than all other kings. And he is presented, among other things, as 1 part human and 2 parts divine. Now that's an example of a detail that we can't read literally. What he's doing to his people tells us something about historical reality. Kings had power and they sometimes abused their power. Kings had rights. There were laws that protected kings and allowed them to do certain things that we wouldn't allow leaders to do today. So we learn something about this ancient society. But this reference to him being 1 part human and 2 parts divine, how are we supposed to read that? What does it tell us if we can't read it literally? This is the moment where we see Gilgamesh not as an historical king, but as a kind of mythic figure. He shares something of the divine. And he is a figure for all of us in some sense. Like we all have to see him as some kind of ideal. The poet is trying to present some kind of ideal through the story of Gilgamesh. And by making him 2 parts divine, he connects the king, or he connects Gilgamesh to this image of divine perfection. He's anything but perfect when we meet him, but he has in him some elements of divine perfection toward which he will be led by this story. Now, what does it mean for the king to become perfected? What does it mean for the king to become more like a god? That is something that the story will try to reveal as it progresses. Okay, we also have, after the gods complain about Gilgamesh, we have Anu, the sky god, speaking to Aruru, the earth goddess, the mother goddess, and essentially telling her to create Gilgamesh's double, to create his equal, to create another Gilgamesh. And here we see an image of creation and an image of man in the kind of original state. Enkidu is created by Aruru. First, she forms in her heart an image of man, of Enkidu. Right? Anu has this something in his mind, and Aruru hears what he says. You must create a double of Gilgamesh. She hears what he says, and she forms that image in her heart. She rinses her hands in water, pinches clay, and lets it fall into the wild, into the forest, right? A piece of clay falls into the forest, and we have Enkidu. His skin was rough, his hair as long as a woman's, his hair matted to his body. We have all these references to other gods and goddesses, right? He is like all these gods and goddesses. He has something of the divine in him, the way that Gilgamesh has something of the divine in him. But what do we see initially? Something not fully human, one could say, right? Something more like an animal. He runs with the gazelles. He's a wild man. Now, how are we supposed to read all of this? Again, we can't exactly read it literally, but we're being shown something about the human and what makes the human human, right? There's something divine in the human. Well, what does that tell us? But the human comes into being as something kind of like an animal, right? The act of creation produces a wild animal, right? Who becomes a man over time. So how are we supposed to read this? Well, again, we can think about early human civilization, right? Early Homo sapiens, where we began, right? Hunters, gatherers, before civilization, what were we like, right? This is a story that's showing us a kind of image of the human before civilization. And Enkidu will become civilized. And that's sort of what we see, the civilization, the humanization of Enkidu, right? Now, again, we can't take this as a kind of literal account, but some kind of metaphorical, figurative account of early man, of early humans. Okay, I'm going to pause because I'm running out of time. I'll see you tomorrow. Okay, hope this was helpful. Bye-bye.